They arrested her without evidence, rushed her through the system, and set her bail at $10,000 until one phone call changed everything. The air was thick with late summer heat as Jessica Carter stepped out of her small apartment, the sun pressing down like iron. She had one goal: grab a loaf of bread and some milk from Mike's Market and get back before her arthritis made walking unbearable. She wasn't the type to linger outside, especially in this neighborhood. Not because it was dangerous, but because people looked at her differently than they did the younger residents of Granton. Being a 70-year-old black woman in a predominantly white, gentrified area meant walking a tightrope. She knew the rules. Keep your hands visible. Don't hesitate too long in any aisle. Don't make sudden movements. And most importantly, don't give them a reason. As she stepped inside the store, the blast of AC hit her like relief. The place was small, crammed with shelves of snacks, canned goods, and overstocked fridges humming in the back. Mike, the owner, gave her a small nod from behind the counter, while a man in a navy polo stood near the exit, scanning the aisles with a hard gaze. Jessica made her way to the dairy section, her fingers brushing over the cold milk carton before placing it in her basket. As she turned toward the front, something caught her eye: a young man in a grey hoodie, stuffing energy bars into his pockets. He moved fast, eyes darting toward the exit. Jessica barely had time to process it before he bolted. The door swung open, the electronic chimes still fading when the alarm screamed through the store. Jessica froze. Mike shot up from his stool, swearing under his breath. The man near the door reacted instantly, stepping forward, eyes scanning. Then, just as quickly, they locked onto her. "You." His voice was sharp. Jessica turned, confused. But he was already on her, a firm hand clamping around her frail arm. "Let go of me," she said, trying to yank away, but his grip was iron. "Don't move." Then she saw it, the badge clipped to his belt. An off-duty cop. A chill of realization washed over her. "The guy ran that way," she said, trying to look over at Mike for confirmation. The store owner hesitated, brows furrowing, but he said nothing. Jessica's pulse hammered. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. But the officer wasn't listening. He turned her around, forcing her hands behind her back. "You think you're slick?" he muttered. "I didn't steal anything." Click. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around her thin wrists. Customers watched. Some whispered. Some pulled out their phones. But no one stepped in. A siren wailed in the distance. The ride to the station felt longer than it should have. Jessica sat stiff in the back seat, wrists aching, heart pounding like a drum. The officer driving hadn't said much after slamming the door, just radioed in a suspect in custody and kept his eyes on the road. Jessica wanted to scream, to make him listen, but something told her it wouldn't matter. The station was a grey, windowless building that smelled like sweat and old paper. The moment she stepped inside, a uniformed officer tugged her forward, steering her past rows of desks and ringing phones. Her sensible flats squeaked against the linoleum as they led her to a holding area. A tall, broad-shouldered cop with a badge reading Sergeant Hawkins looked up from a clipboard. He barely glanced at Jessica before sighing. "Shoplifting?" Hawkins muttered, bored. The arresting officer, Detective Owen Carter, nodded. "Got her at Mike's Market. Owner didn't see the act, but she was the only one near the shelf when the alarm went off." Jessica stiffened. "That's not true. Carter squeezed her shoulder hard enough to silence her. "Camera footage?" Hawkins asked. "Didn't check yet, but—" Carter gave a casual shrug. "She fits the description." Jessica's stomach churned. Description? That guy had been wearing a grey hoodie. Jessica was standing there in a blue floral dress. It didn't matter. Hawkins barely reacted. He just scribbled something down and nodded toward an open doorway. "Take her to processing." Jessica tried again, voice shaking. "I didn't steal anything. Check the cameras. Ask Mike." Carter ignored her. Instead, he yanked her toward a small room where an officer with a camera waited. Mugshot. Fingerprints. A form she had to sign with shaking hands. Then they led her to a cold metal bench, replacing the cuffs with zip ties, and left her there. She wasn't in a cell, just a waiting area with a few others slumped against the walls, all looking just as lost. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Would Jamal even know where she was? He was always working. always too busy. Would anyone know? Would anyone care? Or would she just vanish into the system, buried under paperwork, forgotten behind cold concrete walls? A door creaked open. The scent of stale coffee and cheap cologne filled the air. A public defender in a wrinkled suit stepped in, eyes scanning the folder in his hands as if he had barely glanced at it before walking in. "Jessica Carter?" he asked without looking up, flipping through the pages with rapid indifference. Her throat was dry. "Yes." He sat down, already tapping his pen against the folder. "You've been charged with shoplifting and resisting arrest." Jessica stiffened. "That's not." "I'm here to represent you for the arraignment," he cut in, already moving on, as if her innocence or guilt were nothing more than a formality. "Your hearing is first thing in the morning." Morning. That meant they were keeping her overnight. Panic clawed at her ribs, squeezing tighter with every second. The walls seemed to shrink, the air thickening. The room was cold, the metal bench against her skin even colder. How had it come to this? "I didn't do anything," she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. The lawyer exhaled, rubbing his forehead like he had heard this 1,000 times before. "That's what they all say." Jessica sat back, her breath shaking. For the first time it hit her, really hit her. They weren't going to listen. They were going to bury her. She barely slept that night. The hard cot, the flickering, fluorescent lights, the constant echo of voices beyond the bars. Every sound set her on edge. She had always believed in the system, believed that truth mattered. But now she wasn't so sure. By morning, the sharp bark of her name jolted her upright. The walk to the courtroom was a blur. Her hands were zip-tied again, too tight. Numbness spread through her fingers, but she said nothing. There was no point in protesting anymore. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, lined with rows of wooden benches sparsely filled with spectators who barely spared her a glance. At the front of the room sat Judge Thomas Mercer. His sharp eyes cut through the space, and in an instant, Jessica felt it. He had already made up his mind. The prosecutor, a rigid man with a clipped tone, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught at the scene of a shoplifting incident. The arresting officer witnessed her attempting to flee." Jessica's head snapped up. "That's a lie. I didn't." A tight grip on her arm silenced her. Her lawyer leaned in, voice low. "Don't talk unless I tell you to." Judge Mercer barely spared her a glance. "Does the prosecution have video evidence?" A brief pause. The prosecutor hesitated before answering. "There is footage, but it hasn't been reviewed yet." Jessica's heart pounded. There was footage that would prove she didn't steal anything, that she hadn't resisted. She could almost feel the weight of the truth sitting on a hard drive somewhere, unseen and ignored. Mercer nodded. "Then we proceed without it." "Without it?" Jessica's pulse roared in her ears. She clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Her lawyer straightened. "Your Honor, we ask to postpone until the footage is reviewed." Mercer waved a hand dismissively. "Denied. The police had reason to believe she was guilty. We have enough to move forward." "Enough? Enough for what? A conviction based on an officer's word alone? On an assumption?" Then came the part that made her skin go cold. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Given the defendant's age and lack of stable employment, we request bail be set at $10,000. Jessica's breath caught. 10,000? For a loaf of bread and a carton of milk? Her lawyer turned to her, expression unreadable. "Do you have family who can post bail?" Jessica exhaled slowly, the chaos in her chest cooling into something sharper, more controlled. A slow smile tugged at the corner of her lips, and she lifted her chin. They had no idea. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the courtroom like a blade. "My son," she said. "He's the U.S. Attorney General." Silence fell like a hammer. The prosecutor's face paled. Judge Mercer's gaze flickered, the first crack in his stony expression. The courtroom seemed to exhale in a collective murmur. Jessica leaned back, watching the power shift before her eyes. It was almost laughable how quickly the air changed, how the very people who had dismissed her seconds ago were suddenly reconsidering everything. Mercer cleared his throat. "Is this true?" Her lawyer nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor. Jessica Hart is the mother of Attorney General Daniel Hart." A cold sweat broke out on the prosecutor's brow. The judge sat back, suddenly more measured, more careful. Your Honor, the prosecutor started, voice unsteady. Given these new circumstances, we may need to re-evaluate the terms of bail. Jessica's lawyer smiled for the first time that day. Your Honor, given that my client has no criminal history and was merely purchasing food, I move for immediate release on her own recognizance. Mercer's fingers tapped against his desk. He glanced at Jessica as if seeing her for the first time. Then, with a heavy sigh, he straightened. Bail is denied, Mercer said, his voice now filled with caution. The defendant is free to go. Case dismissed. A stunned silence filled the room before the gavel struck down, final and absolute. Jessica stood slowly, the weight of injustice still heavy in her bones, but she kept her expression unreadable. The prosecutor looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The arresting officer, who had sat smugly in the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She turned to leave, the burn of their stares following her. Outside, a black car was already waiting at the curb. The door opened before she reached it, and her son, Daniel Hart, stepped out, his face a mask of controlled fury. Are you all right? He asked, scanning her for any signs of harm. Jessica smiled faintly. I am now. He exhaled sharply, then glanced toward the courthouse. They will regret this. She placed a hand on his arm. I just want the footage reviewed. I want the truth to be seen. He nodded. Oh, it will be. And after that, they'll have to answer for more than just this. Jessica let the words settle. Justice wasn't always immediate, but it was coming. And this time, she wouldn't be the one left unheard.